Hey y'all, it's Andrew with Free Tours by Foot New Orleans. Today I'm going to take you for a walk through a neighborhood that a lot of our visitors see, but that doesn't get, I think, the full credit it deserves. It's right across the street from the French Quarter. It's full of hotels. A lot of people stay there, but then in the morning set foot outside their door, head to some other neighborhood, and never really get a full impression of the place where they're staying. Not realizing that it is the first American neighborhood in New Orleans, one of the oldest neighborhoods of any kind. It's the home of a lot of beautiful buildings, the World War II museum, some great art spaces, some crazy monuments, and a lot of great stories. So we're going to explore that with 4K video. So this is a good one for your big screen, with three-dimensional audio. So it's a good one for your headphones if you've got them. And I'm going to share some stories as we walk, give you the experience of being there as best we can. So y'all drop us a like and subscribe. Give us a comment down below. Let us know what you think. Check out our videos in other cities via our other channels. And if you'd like to tip your guide, you can find the means to do that in the description down below. Thanks very much for watching. Here we go. We begin, y'all, with a walk over towards Canal Street, the edge of the neighborhood. This is a neighborhood mostly, like I said, people stay in, but don't give a whole lot of credit to. And like the stuff that catches your eye a lot of the time is really vague, really generic. But it is full of surprises, like a very unusual Moorish revival Catholic church. This is the Immaculate Conception Church. And even if it's mostly an area where people stay, even the places to stay are pretty vintage in their own right sometimes. So, crossing illegally, y'all, bad role model. On the other side of the street here, we've got the very popular Roosevelt Hotel. And the Roosevelt is one of these places that has, modern capacity and vintage style at the same time. Crazy elaborate lobby. This entrance gives you a sense for the style in the interior. And it's especially notable at Christmas. You see our Christmas video, we spend a quick minute in there. And their bar here really gives you some 1920s vibe. So they've got a place, so previously this place had what's sometimes called the first nightclub in the country. It was a bar called The Cave, and it was themed, so it was designed as a cave, and they had employees dressed like mermaids. So you have some alluring person waving to you in the distance, very much like a regular bar. It was just more obvious that they were employees and not available. But that place is no longer there, sorry to say. But what's there is the Sazerac Bar, named for the city's signature cocktail. And it's famous for, similar atmosphere to the lobby of the place, upscale vibe across the board, and expensive but very good cocktails. And they do a very good Sazerac, which I'll tell you more about later on. And they also were famous at one time, still can do a good job with this, for their Ramos Gin Fizz. This is a drink they bought the recipe for from its inventor, Mr. Ramos, who was the very unusual combination of a bartender and a preacher. And he invented this drink that was extremely labor intensive, but our famous governor, Huey Long, was extremely fond of it. We're actually going to be doing a video in Baton Rouge pretty soon, y'all, so tune into that for a bit more about Huey Long if he's a favorite of yours. And Huey Long actually brought the head bartender from the Roosevelt to New York while he was there as a senator, and had the guy train the New York bartenders how to make this drink quote-unquote right. And also, legend holds that he built pre-interstate system, airline highway, just so he could get between Baton Rouge, the state capital, and New Orleans really fast and be able to get his drink of choice expediently. We're on Canal Street now, y'all. This is the big wide street that divides the French Quarter on one side from our neighborhood that we're focusing on today on the other side. And I just want to point out this building, the Boston Club. This is one of the very few residences standing here, a little crooked today, as you can see, which points out its age. And the Boston Club is the third oldest social club in the country. It's been here at this spot since the 1880s. The institution goes back to the 1840s. And it's a highly exclusive club for moneyed Anglo-Saxon men, which tells you a lot about the neighborhood that we are spending time with today. That is the force that tended to really make its mark on this place. So I've been dodging mentioning a name for it so far, just because I think probably the name is in flux right now. So locals will tend to call this neighborhood, I'm distinguishing between, over here we have the French Quarter, and on this side of the street we have the other one. We tend to call it the Central Business District or the Warehouse District, which are, you know, not exciting names, even if they're true. It is a business neighborhood. It's where a lot of people come for their conventions or their conferences. And it does have warehouses in it, but that's far from unique here. And it used to have a more distinctive name, which was, it was called the Faubourg St. Mary, and that's when it was brand new. This was the second neighborhood, more or less, on this side of the river in New Orleans history. And Faubourg described these little towns that set up outside the city walls. So there used to be a wall right here, not exactly where Canal Street is, but kind of on a diagonal, dividing the French Quarter from the nothing that lay beyond it over here. So Faubourg St. Mary, or Faubourg Saint Marie, would have been a perfectly good name, but it also ended up back then getting referred to as the American sector. And I think that's probably the most illustrative name that it's had. So I'm gonna try to play a little branding game and call it the American sector today, even though that's not a thing you hear out of people's mouths very often. And it's not my idea, I'm borrowing it. And you'll see from where later on. Also, I think a name change is inevitable because I said we call it the Central Business District. Technically that's just a part of the neighborhood, but we usually abbreviate that to CBD, and the connotations around that acronym are changing rapidly, so it's gonna happen one way or another. Y'all can see the plushness of these facades. So like, this is what captain of industry type buildings looked like in the early 1800s when this neighborhood developed. You know, y'all know what captain of industry buildings look like now, but strong contrast. Lots of different materials. These guys were coming down from the Northeast, so they brought eclectic tastes with them. This guy in the middle is cast iron on the outside. A lot of stone too, which is not, for one thing, something that occurs in Louisiana, and not a great idea here. Anyway, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Basically, the American sector was the place where American businessmen came and settled in the years after the Louisiana Purchase. So, giving all this a little bit of context. The French Quarter, behind the wall over here, was the whole city from 1718 until 1788. It was surrounded by plantations, including the land over here. And in 1788, the guy who owned this plantation on this side decided to sell his property off and let it be subdivided into smaller properties. First of many, and pretty much all plantation owners in what's today the metro area to have done that. So at that point, this becomes open for business and for residences. And it happens first just on behalf of Creoles, the people who lived over here, your French, Spanish, and or West African extracted people. And some of them do set up shop over here, but mostly it is shop. It is warehouses, it's the odd personal home. But then, and you get Americans coming in too, and that's because a little ways up ahead, beyond the soon-to-be Four Seasons Hotel, the tall one up there at the end. You had the port expanding over into the Faubourg Saint-Marie, and it also existed over along the French Quarter. And the Mississippi is a big river, so there were a bunch of people from the frontiers of the United States coming down and bringing their goods with them. So they tended to set up shop along the waterfront over there, and the Creoles got a pretty big cut of the traffic that came through here. So the U.S. government thought, why not change that? And Thomas Jefferson, president at the time, sent some emissaries to Napoleon and said, can we buy New Orleans? And he said, yes, if you take all of Louisiana, which was big enough back then that it would have meant doubling the size of the United States. And they did. They bought the whole thing. The U.S. doubled in size, and up-and-coming businessmen in the Northeast, what they heard was, ready, set, go. And they rushed down here in droves to be first to get a nip at the pie. And you can see what a big deal the federal government made of this place, because this was the custom house that they built. So they invested. This took a tidy little 3 decades and change to build. And when it was finished in the 1880s, it was the second largest federal building in the United States, which made it the second largest any building in the United States. So that shows you, they really thought New Orleans was going to be the place to be, and it was. A lot of money passed through this building. Pretty unusual little spot. Those column capitals make this a rare example of Egyptian revival architecture. And you can't look at it today without being reminded, second largest building in the country. That was before we had malls and mega hotels, which loom over everything at this point. But pretty impressive for its day, or for any day. And clad in granite. It's brick on the inside, thank goodness. This thing is super heavy. You can see it's in better shape than the Boston Club, so it was well built, and it was built in a way that caused it to sink really evenly, but it did sink several feet before it stopped, and that was while it was under construction. So big, heavy stone buildings in the mud. Maybe that is another nickname candidate for the neighborhood. Stone buildings sinking into the mud. This also was a hiding place for the governor of Louisiana in 1874 as a sort of post-Civil War battle unfolded out here. This is the era we call Reconstruction, and there was a more or less installed government. That was from the perspective of the ex-Confederates who had not had a say in who was installed. And as a result of that frustration, the White League basically did a huge massacre of the local police and installed themselves in charge of the state, and this back then was the state capital. So this was a massacre both of police and of a march of Black Civil War veterans that was happening at the same time. We call that the Battle of Liberty Place. And y'all may remember the monuments business that went down a few years ago here. And one of those that was removed least controversially, and that had been proposed to be removed several times before, one of the four, was a monument celebrating the Battle of Liberty Place, which was put up pretty shortly after the fact. So, passing by now, Sazerac House. Y'all might have had a glimpse of this on the way in. This is a pretty newly installed location of the Sazerac distillery. Tours are free, so why not? Mentioned the Sazerac Bar back before. Check that out. All of those for free, I'm sure. So the Sazerac drink that I mentioned is the signature cocktail of New Orleans, the official cocktail of New Orleans. It's originally a cognac-based drink, and Sazerac, a company called Sazerac de Forges et Filles, was a French cognac dealer. And there was some kind of company called the Sazerac House or the Sazerac Bar in New Orleans, changing locations pretty steadily, going back to the 1850s at least. And it was a place that sold that cocktail. Howdy. Making new friends, y'all. So the Sazerac company today derives from local dealers in French cognac. And they have just recently made their way back to town. That place opened just a couple years ago now. The Ruby Slipper, super, super popular place to get breakfast / brunch. And the Pelham Hotel that is above it, this whole spot was the home for a while of the founder of New Orleans, as he's usually called, this guy Bienville, the one who chose the site for New Orleans based on observing and learning the way that it was used by Native Americans. So this was where his house was. Originally, this whole side of the city was his plantation, and then it passed into the hands of Jesuit priests, and then eventually back into the hands of private individuals. And one of those guys was the one who decided to partition it, to subdivide it in 1788. And usually when that happens, and a lot of the time, those owners would put their own name on the neighborhood. So we have on the river side of the French Quarter, or rather on the lake side of the French Quarter, a neighborhood called Faubourg Treme, which is named for Claude Treme, who owned the land. And then on the downriver side of the French Quarter, we have Faubourg Marigny, named for Bernard de Marigny, its owner. You can see the street name up ahead. This is Gallier Street, and that was the name of the owner. This was not called Faubourg Gravier for any length of time. We say Gravier is how he'd say it. So pretty quickly after the whole thing got underway, Mr. Gravier's wife died. And she actually was the one who had owned the land. She got it from her first husband, and then Mr. Gravier got it from her when they married. So her name was Marie, so Faubourg Sainte-Marie. Named after the saint who she was named after, was what stuck. But Gravier got to be the name of the street and of a park that we'll see a little later on, which does not bear that name anymore. A lot of different industries got set up in here over time. So we're passing by the stone building back there, was built for a bank. You had lots and lots and lots of cotton and sugar factors in the neighborhood. This little street is called Picayune Place, named after the Daily Picayune, an old New Orleans newspaper. They had their offices right around the corner here on Camp Street. But really the big money here was in shipping and the kind of middleman businesses of cotton and sugar, the big cash crops in Louisiana then and largely now. Rice and coffee were important too. Coffee coming in from elsewhere, rice also being grown in Louisiana then. But you know, everywhere needs a newspaper, so they operated out of right over there. We got some of today's surviving monsters of design on this block too. International House Hotel occupying a couple of these. The others not having a big company name attached to them, but they're pretty. Again, crossing illegally. Do as I say, not as I do. Check you out. Well, if I was to give you one example of a neighborhood industrialist who really just wraps the whole thing up in a bow, it would be somebody who was in a pretty different industry from the ones that I've mentioned so far. This guy was named James Caldwell. We're going to come around to where his facility was located. And he was a theater guy. He actually was born in England and then came over to the United States, worked on the East Coast for a bit, got a theater company going, and he was the company's manager, so he really was the decider. And his whole company of performers was contractually obligated to go wherever he decided they were going to perform. And it's really telling in terms of how people thought of New Orleans at the time that he didn't tell his company that they were going to be going to New Orleans until they were halfway here. So definitely a place of opportunity, but a place of, let's call it terror as well. But he came here and he established one of the first really major forces for theater in New Orleans. And this is, y'all, one of my favorite New Orleans stories. I don't get to tell it on in-person tours pretty much ever because there's just not a lot of demand for exploring this neighborhood with a guide. So this is a happy day for me. So James Caldwell first sets up shop with his company in a theater in the French Quarter called the Orleans Theater, and it's where the Bourbon Orleans Hotel is today. And he shared that building with the first opera company in the United States. And he, besides being the company's manager, was also its lead actor. So by day, he managed the company. And then by night, he played like Hamlet and everybody else, 6 nights a week. And they tended to rotate shows every few days. So the memorization pace, just the pace of work in general, was pretty mind-blowing and hard to imagine today. But kept up that pace and somehow still had time for a hobby, which was gas lighting. Quick pause. This is the old corporate headquarters of United Fruit. This would be, if I picked one other industrialist to tell you about. From a little later, this would be the guy. As it is, I'll tell you his story on a walk along St. Charles Avenue sometime when we go by his house. So, James Caldwell was a big fan of gas lighting technology. And after working in the theater here for a little bit, he established the first gas-lit theater in the country in this neighborhood. And this is 1822, 1823. Got Luke over here. Good spot for an oyster happy hour. So we're talking like, this is when this neighborhood was somewhere you were likelier to go to hunt than to work, and certainly than to get entertained in any kind of high-end, classy way. So this was the first major building, like not a warehouse, not a home, in the neighborhood. And it was also the first gas-lit theater in the country. A couple years before anyone in New York pulled that off. And to get to it from the French Quarter, where almost everybody lived, you had to walk along planks laid across the mud. It was not a glamorous arrival, but people did it, and they did it in droves. And it was kind of a cross-section of everybody. It was local society. It was free people of color. Enslaved people got passes to go to the theater sometimes. It was the boatmen, the Americans. And they came in enough numbers that he had the money to gaslight the street on the way to the theater. So, yeah, you were walking along planks, but the planks had streetlights. And after doing this for a little while, for some years, in the 1830s he had a problem, which was that a sixth of the population of New Orleans had died from cholera. Not a lot of tickets being sold, so he got out of the business, retired from theater, and he ended up going full-time into his gaslighting hobby. And during that time, he basically founded the first municipal gaslighting system in the country for New Orleans. And at the end of that time, it turned out that he had, in fact, gaslit the entire city because he hadn't really retired from theater. Y'all knew a gaslighting joke was coming in there somewhere. He went back into theater a year later, and he built the St. Charles Theater, which was right here. and it was the biggest theater in New Orleans or in the country. It seated 4,100 people, which is more than any theater in New Orleans seats today. And you got a picture at this spot, this massive, like, Greek temple. And once you went inside, there were, like, a main show and then 5 other acts happening all in the same evening, and this massive 2-ton chandelier hanging over the middle of the space. And to just make a point about the scale of that, the population of New Orleans back then was like 100,000 people, rapidly growing, but like way, way smaller than it is today. So to seat as many as 4,100 people a night with a population that size, albeit swelled by passers-through, that is still, you know, we still have travelers as a big part of the city today, you'd have to be doing local theater for an audience of like 50,000, which you'd have to do in, say, the Superdome, which is a little ways down there. So you can imagine this place never sold out, never made much money, but it really impressed a lot of people, which was basically the formula. And then one day, there was a construction yard right next door. They were, accounts from the Times suggest, busily and poetically building coffins, and a fire lit over there, spread into the theater right before a show happened. Somehow nobody died, but the fire became the show, and James Caldwell had a front row seat. He stood right outside watching as his 2-ton chandelier came crashing to the ground. And witnesses from the time say, as he watched, he said, "What magnificence, what splendor." Self-aware for a minute, but never quite got over it. Became a pretty awful guy to work with. Got driven out of the business and became a politician and died wealthy. This is formerly One Shell Square, now the Hancock Whitney building. I'd go all the way up, but you get the idea. Tallest building in the state when it was built back in 70 schma, when most of the skyscrapers went up, and, you know, same story over here. They built 2 other St. Charles theaters on the site of the old one, each one smaller than the last. And one of the performers who played at the second St. Charles Theater was John Wilkes Booth, famously an actor, famously assassinated President Abraham Lincoln, and famously did so in a theater. All that happened naturally before the assassination took place. So, speaking of presidential assassins with 3 names, well, come back to that. We're on Poydras right now. This is the kind of heart of the business corridor. We've got the Superdome down there, various office towers. The namesake here is a big philanthropist, Julian Poydras, who was one of the people who encouraged Beltran Gravier to subdivide his plantation and bought the very first lot right back there where the theater used to be, and got the street named for him as a result. If you watched our Magazine Street video, you know that that neighborhood markets are a big part of the development of the city, and there was one here as well, sort of a French market style space, a little ways back behind me. Lots of art along the strip today. In this case, someone disapproves of art being explained. Alarm going on inside, y'all. I'd say me stopping and helping would probably be too many spoons in the pot. Big fan, y'all, of these old painted ads. This one for Zatarain's, one of the classic local seasoning brands. Buy DIY jambalaya out of a box from them. Okay, I said presidential assassins with 3 names, and maybe you figured out who I meant. Lee Harvey Oswald used to be a big part of the New Orleans story. This building over here, lock that in your head, is the Hale Boggs Federal Building. So earlier when we were walking along Canal Street, passed by a spot, Canal in St. Charles, where Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested. He was from New Orleans, didn't spend a lot of time here, but a little bit as an adult shortly before the Kennedy assassination. And he was in front of a store over there handing out pro-Castro literature. And the owner of the store was Cuban and wasn't a fan of Castro. Came outside and they got into a scuffle, and everybody involved was arrested for disturbing the peace. But if you had taken one of his leaflets, the address you would have been referred to if you were interested in the pro-Castro cause was a building that stood right here. A different one, but same spot. And he didn't actually have office space there. He was referring to a place where he didn't have any actual space to receive anything or anybody. But a possible coincidence, possible connection popped up later, which was that after the Kennedy assassination, the local DA, Jim Garrison, ended up accusing a private investigator who worked in that building and some of his associates of being co-conspirators in the assassination. And the fact that all parties involved were located in that building where Lee Harvey Oswald claimed to have office space. Well, major coincidence, if it's a coincidence, and certainly fodder for the idea that the lone assassin explanation was insufficient. So, for the folks who are followers of that story, that piece of geography back there, albeit again, different building today, is a bit of a pilgrimage site. Working our way along Poydras past this little standout. Not a lot of buildings like this on Poydras anymore. It's been too high a demand for the older buildings to survive. But this one is Mother's, which is a very popular, famously famous po' boy destination. The line tends to be very long. So that and the American sector location of Ruby Slipper, both I can say, weigh your options. Okay, great view right now of the soon-to-be Four Seasons, and great view momentarily of one of my favorite things in the neighborhood. Okay, so got a picture that right here at this spot there's a row of similar buildings to what we've seen, stuff like on the next block, blocking our view. There's not a parking lot here, so we're just gonna look this way and pretend we're on an ordinary street. Well, this neighborhood was doing pretty badly in the 70s. We'd had the same kind of problems that a lot of historic downtowns did, which was post-World War II, white flight, a lot of industries moving out to the suburbs, and consequently empty buildings, low occupancy, relatively high crime in neighborhoods like this. And so little revitalization measures were a popular thing to do. And one of them here was the idea that we should take a little spot to honor our Italian heritage. And it was designed to be like, I don't know if you've been to Rome, but if when you walk around Rome, you just pop into a piazza out of nowhere. It comes up as a surprise. Well, the notion here was right as you got to the end of this block, past all the buildings, voila, that would hit you out of nowhere. So this is the Piazza D'Italia. It is our foremost, and I want to say only, real monument to the very large Italian presence in the city. And even though they weren't really Rome Italian, the way this kind of implies, it doesn't really imply any one place because it is so very of its time. So this is, again, late 1970s creation. It borrows from the classical styles, as many things here do. it borrows them, and then the classical styles do not want them back afterwards. Let's see how good a view we can get. Used to be open all the time. Nowadays, locked more often than not. But you really got to see it at night to get the full effect. You can see the chrome around the column capitals, and maybe you can make out there are bands of neon, so it lights up neon intentionally, very, very 70s. And the whole fountain in the middle, you can get a bit of a view of that, is in the shape of Italy. And there are jets of water that are supposed to come from the columns as well to imply the sort of graceful curves of classic monument capitals, but in motion. So if you ever were to find it open, it would be from right over here. So this monument, it made a splash, as it were. When it was first built, people have called it the ugliest monument in New Orleans. And it was pretty quickly, so the whole notion, besides honoring the Italian presence, was to stimulate some more activity here. And it needed that because of this whole kind of depression that the neighborhood was in. But following this, so this thing gets done in 1978, and then in the 1980s we have a huge oil bust for the last century or so. New Orleans's and all of Louisiana's well-being has been very much tied to the up and down cycle of the price of gas and oil. So it's really hard to get anybody to build anything down here. The notion was that this monument, people would just want to be next to this monument all the time, and it would spur a lot of building in the area. Didn't happen. So the place gets abandoned pretty fast. And one thing people like to call it is the world's first postmodern ruin, which is a really fun phrase to say. I wonder if there's an abandoned theme park somewhere that might fit the bill even better. But either way, fell into disrepair. It is not in such disrepair today. You're not looking at it in postmodern ruin form. It got restored in the 2000s, spruced up a little bit more in just the last couple of years, but still is not full-time really doing anything. We will see what the future has in store for the Piazza D'Italia. Anyway, as we come through here, we're on little old Lafayette Street. This is one that favors pedestrians over cars. Barely room for a car in here. You can imagine, given this was a neighborhood built in 1788, how much it had to be modified to fit cars. You can see right here at Constance and Lafayette. Yeah, they did a nice job. Excellent choices all around. So this is kind of the scale of streets. If you go far enough back in time, you can see Merrill right there at the end. That's one of Emeril Lagasse's 3 restaurants. So you can imagine how much things had to be changed for cars to fit. Many, many, many streets were widened, and a lot of buildings were torn down to make that possible. Passing by one of the neighborhood escape rooms. Escape my room, and it's, dweeby looking, y'all. I'm talking about me, not about their design. They look great. I'm in the way. Got my backpack on the front and everything. How embarrassing. Anyway. The other thing you can maybe imagine is what a terrible idea it is to try and park in this neighborhood if you don't have to. So, highly recommended. Avoid that if you can. It's not super, super pedestrian by habit, but by design it's not bad. And given this is right next to the French Quarter, and given that it is where I'd say the majority of our visitors stay, it was way easier to slot hotels into this neighborhood than into the French Quarter itself. Like, the stuff is all right outside your door. Might as well. All right, we are by another monument of the federal government. This is today called the John Minor Wisdom Building. It's been a few things. It was built, believe it or not, as a post office. Early 20th century, I think, if I'm remembering my dates right. briefly served as a public school in there because of damage to other schools after Hurricane Betsy, and then became the home of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And it is named after one of its members, John Minor Wisdom. Honest to God name of this guy. Lived in the Garden District, became a judge, of course, because what else do you do with a name like that? And he was on the court at the time when local or regional cases, the Fifth Circuit was a little bigger back then than it is today. He was on the court when it had to decide cases related to Brown v. Board of Education. So precedent from that came down beginning in 1954, and he was part of implementing school desegregation in this part of the country. Other civil rights decisions too, so I'm going to get y'all just such a view over here. So other thing the neighborhood is known for is contemporary art. We have big sculptures like this all over the place. And I just think this is about the most representative view you can get. Contemporary art in the foreground, a little bit overwhelming the scene right now, but there's Benjamin Franklin across the street, super, super American. You can make out some Greek Revival facade across the way, and the looming Capital One office tower and Entergy office tower in the background. So all of the things that comprise this neighborhood in one place. So we have reached this neighborhood's equivalent of Jackson Square. Here we are at what once would have been called Gravier Square, Place Gravier, but now is called Lafayette Square because the Revolutionary War hero, the Marquis de Lafayette, paid the U.S. a visit in the 1820s, toured the country, and got things named after him. Everywhere he went, this is not him, this is Benjamin Franklin, who you will often see with Mardi Gras beads. Only way you'd know that you're in New Orleans and not up in the Northeast somewhere. So, Marquis de Lafayette was a bigger deal than Beltran Gravier ever was. And so naming something after him in place of Mr. Gravier was a pretty easy call. This one who we're sneaking up on is Henry Clay of 3/5 Compromise fame. He gets the central spot. Yes, excellent form on that wheel, I think. I'm not the best judge. And the brick building on the left, y'all, that one used to be a business college called Soule College, and it relocated to a building you may know if anyone saw American Horror Story Coven. The mansion that it makes up the school in that show actually was a school. So this school moved from here up to there, and I want to say 1920 something. So a little bit of a horror television connection. All right, this Gallier Hall. So I've kind of alluded to the rivalry between Americans and the Creole population, and it scaled up enough. I mean, Americans were coming in and kind of building redundant versions of everything and grabbing onto whatever power they could, that they really viewed, the Creoles viewed them as obnoxious upstarts and major threats to their way of life, and Americans in turn viewed Creoles as stubborn, backwards, backwater ignoramuses. And so they did what they could to centralize power up here. And that included splitting the city into 3 different cities for a while. So as much as Canal Street is a dividing line kind of socially and functionally today, it actually was a political boundary at one time between what was called the first municipality, the French Quarter, the second municipality, which was all of this, and the third municipality, which was the Mairie. That was 1836. By 1852, they merged back together. During that time, in the 1840s, the first municipality decided to build its own city hall, and this was it. And James Gallier Sr., who it's named for, is one of the big deal architects in New Orleans and thereabouts. This didn't get done until after the municipalities merged together again in 1853, but by that time, power had consolidated up here enough that this became the city hall. And it was up through the 1950s when we ended up moving out to, you can't actually see it from here, but off in the distance, those buildings that you see over there, they're pretty close to the new one, which is just so much more of a mid-20th century building than a mid-19th century building. So not a highlight destination of its own. This is still the ceremonial city hall, so various events go on here, and when Mardi Gras parades roll along St. Charles, which they do going from this direction to this direction, not only are stands set up where viewers, it's pretty much the only spot where you pay to view the parade. Well, there's balconies along the way where you pay, but the main place. And the mayor watches from right over here, and parade floats will pause to propose a toast. So kind of a key spot, and often one where the cameras on parades are set up. Over here, one more monument, or partial lack thereof. So mentioned the whole monument situation here over the last few years, and I'm going to be talking about that a little more. So if this is a subject that grinds your gears, feel free to fast forward a couple minutes. This one was of a fellow named John Mcdonough, and while there were 4 that were removed by the city by decision of the city council and through pretty popular support in town, this one was removed during protests in 2020 by just people with a rope. And the monument wasn't destroyed, it was knocked down, it was nearby, and the city recovered it and has not placed it back yet. I don't know what the plans are. This happened to a few monuments around during that time. And, you know, during the city-sponsored changes that have happened, it's always centered around the Civil War. Mentioned the Battle of Liberty Place as one of the contexts for that. And then there were 3 other Civil War leaders who were removed. Following that, too, you got a pretty large wave of street name changes from Civil War leadership to various other people, oftentimes civil rights leaders, but various categories. But that guy is one example of where there are some pretty polarizing figures here who are not Civil War related in and of themselves. So this guy, John Mcdonough, lived out his whole life before the Civil War. Died in, I think, 1850. But he was a huge property holder and slaveholder here from Baltimore originally, so par for the course, came down from the Northeast, well northeast of us anyway. And when he got here, he at first was he was in trade, worked with all kinds of stuff, but eventually became a real estate guy. And the way he, in part, created his real estate empire, you can see some stuff that was built during WPA era here, some very Art Deco, the glamour of work kind of reliefs. So he had a strategy, which was he would buy a piece of property somewhere, rent it to become a brothel, and then, of course, the sensitivities at the time being what they were, a lot of people nearby would move out. And of course, their buildings would then go on the market, and the brothel, being present, would depress their value. And so he'd just buy up all of these buildings in the same area, and then he'd kick out the brothel and start renting out to the sort of high-rent, respectable crowd who the quality of the buildings and the location, absent the brothel, originally appealed to. So he became kind of a massive citywide slumlord in this way. And for people who look at him in a sort of leaderly way, there's 2 big things that give him credit. One of them is that in his will, he left a lot of money for public schools, and that included schools that were integrated up to a certain point. And this is, again, pre-Civil War, so you're talking about free children of color who are fairly small in number, but were a presence here. And then you get from him also this strategy of carefully wrapped monuments. They want to surprise you all with a present when you get here. What could it be? The shape will tell. He had a thing where he would he'd acquire an enslaved person and then give them sort of a 15-year process at the end of which they would get emancipated, and in the course of which time there was some literacy and some job skills that were obtained. And this was unusual for sure. And he emancipated other people in his ownership during the time when he died as well in his will. So in addition to that funding for schools, there was also that. But then also, he was a massive slave owner to begin with, and he was a slumlord, and so many other people make the point that he was not any kind of role model for monumenting. And earlier I mentioned the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954. So that year, one of the very first civil rights protests in New Orleans took place around that monument. There used to be a tradition of school children coming out for John Mcdonough Day and leaving flowers all over the place. And the white children all went first, and the black children stood out there and waited until they were all done before they got to thank the guy. And in 1954, there was a boycott among the black schools of that event. And it really happened before you would have seen much else like it. So, important spot, one way or another. Whatever one thinks of the monument question, whatever your philosophy may be, it is today a spot many people are thinking about, and it has been for a long time. Nothing new there. This is St. Patrick's Church. It is the home of the second Catholic parish in Louisiana, or in New Orleans rather. So I gave it away, y'all. We're doing this on Sunday. Mass is still held here all the time. And the name gives it away, the Irish Catholic Church. Irish people were a huge presence here, and they kind of represent the, what do I want to call it, the crossover crowd. So on the one hand, they were English speakers, but on the other hand, they were Catholic, by and large, not all of them. You certainly had Protestants among them, but they were religiously like the Creoles, but they were linguistically like the new arrivals. So represented a little bit of a third option. That was built also by an Irish architect. We've mentioned him already, James Gallier Sr. He built Gallier Hall as well, and lots of other things here. And he was an Irish Protestant, hired to complete a Catholic church. This is one of my favorite blocks just for building types. So when I said earlier kind of a Northeastern Creole hybrid, there's some good examples of that here. So the bright colors, not just regional, but very regional. Cast iron balconies and galleries. This is a thing that happened in the French Quarter, and the fashion really transcended. And we talked about the challenge with materials. So a lot of these are brick, as you can see, but this one, the slightly taller one in tan, looks like it's made out of stone. There's big block shapes all over it. That's plaster with stone-like grooves scratched into it, because brick was a much more available, much cheaper, and much over time wiser material here. Anyway, Camp Street, the street we're on right now, is really the one I do for the walk if you're first and foremost a building watcher. Speaking of interesting buildings, check her out. So we've got a standout spot, which is just an event venue. So you wouldn't really get, just passing by this, a good explanation for why the lighthouse. But this was built for an organization called Lighthouse for the Blind. It's an organization all about services for blind folks. And so it made a lot of sense when it was built. Now it's just eye-catching. So if you're hosting, I don't know, a reception there, it's really easy to say, look for the building with the lighthouse on it. Another really great street for buildings is this one up here, Julia Street, the cross street. It's also an art gallery strip, so you get these huge art walks that take place here periodically. Modest ones on weekends throughout the year, but the big one, the summer, is White Linen Night, where for the most part everybody wears white linen because it's sweltering here in summer and it breathes really well. So huge crowds of people clad in white all up and down this strip, hobnobbing. The kind of architectural standout here is this strip right here. These are called the 13 Sisters. Row houses, 13 of them. And you can see the very northeastern style brick facade. This goes back before these places were super, super Greek Revival. That comes in a little bit later. And then there's this part, which we can see in the back, and you can really more easily catch the identicalness of these from this back angle, because these parts are more discrete from one another. So you can see them in a long row. There we go. So we see buildings like this in the French Quarter all the time, and over here. These are outbuildings which served as a mixture of slave quarters, servant quarters, kitchens, and possibly carriage houses and or stables. Not always in great shape. I don't know if you can make out a few doors down. There's one that looks pretty ruinous, and there's one that's outright missing. So they are maybe the least likely part of the building to be preserved. But they were universal, and they are a little nod to the fact that courtyards are a feature of all of these. Slaveholding was a kind of up or down question among these folks, because so many of them were coming from the Northeast. They had domestic habits that preferred servants, but they were parts of industries that were very much in the slave world, and some of them were slave traders themselves. So not a uniform answer across the board, but it was, if the church folks their space. Yeah, the structure was the same, usually, regardless of whether domestic servants or enslaved domestics was your taste. Haven't pointed out a lot of restaurants to y'all, but Julia Street's a great opportunity for that. Carmo over here is an interesting one. The concept here is like equatorial cuisine. Obviously that spans a lot of different places and cultures, but it kind of works, and it especially kind of works here because definitely West African cuisine is a big influence here, Caribbean and Latin American cuisine. So you get stuff that feels very neighborly and very constituent of New Orleans food. Not traditional, but informs traditional. And it's also one of the most vegetarian/vegan friendly places, albeit other options too. Another place y'all might be aware of uptown is the Columns Hotel. This is a hotel, but it's also a, like, most people think of it as a bar. It's a restaurant and bar, but it's located on St. Charles Avenue, one of the big impressive houses that you can patronize as a business. And the guy who lived there, this was his cigar factory. Yet another of the industries that we'd have seen having some presence in the neighborhood. And yeah, when we talk about manufacturing spaces and warehouses, we think size, and we're really getting over into the part of the neighborhood that speaks more to that. I have New Orleans Glassworks and Printmaking Studio down the way, one of the cool art establishments in the neighborhood. Auction House Market, we've very much gotten on the bandwagon with food halls in the last few years. This is one of those. And another restaurant, Pesh. As you can guess, they're making very clear in the branding. Seafood. Pretty modern seafood menu. Meaning creative, not super of any one tradition, but a lot of it sourced close to home. So one place I can definitely recommend, especially if you're getting weary of fried stuff. Another kind of cool thing about this intersection back here. So this is the intersection of Julia and Magazine. And that was where really the first modern New Orleans Mardi Gras parade happened. Really the first Mardi Gras parade at all. Modern does not belong in there. So we had a Mardi Gras tradition for a long time that was all about just kind of pleasant panic in the streets. Just have a lot of fun, wear a costume, and go crazy. And to civilize things a little bit, the notion was this group of Anglo-Americans, the Pickwick Club, we're in our art strip now, y'all. Pickwick Club, which was similar to the Boston Club, high society social group, very selective, very exclusive, ended up creating the Mystic Crew of Comus And it was a Mardi Gras organization, coined the word crew that we use, Krewe, for Mardi Gras organizations today, and also established the pattern of naming them after figures from mythology or literature. So Comus being a minor Roman mythic figure. So their idea was to organize things into parade following this tradition out of Mobile, Alabama. And we can get more into that. We'll do another Mardi Gras video sometime. We had a lot of fun with that last year. But the first parade started right back at that intersection and led the way to a theater, not the St. Charles, but another of the many that was here at one time. And they held a Mardi Gras ball, which that was already highly traditional at the time among Creoles, but it was a co-opted tradition that now is a critical culmination usually to the parade tradition. Another warehouse here, and former home, as of pretty recently, of the New Orleans Children's Museum, which I know, like, activities to do with kids can seem like a hard thing to come by. It's actually, they're pretty plentiful in New Orleans. The Audubon properties, the zoo, the aquarium, and until pretty recently, the insectarium was located in the U.S. Custom House that we passed back there. It's not there anymore, but it's moving into the aquarium. So that's another thing you could hit up. And the Children's Museum has relocated out to City Park. So that is worth a view. I don't know if I can see the street name across the way. Tchoupitoulas. That's how to say that. It's kind of a French confusion of Choctaw language, so possibly meaningless, possibly meaningful. This first thing located along it with the letter E is Emeril's, the original Emeril's restaurant. So we've seen the two in the neighborhood at this point. The third one being uptown on St. Charles, not too far away. And we saw that in our walk of Lower St. Charles, so check that video out if you want to collect all three. So Tchoupitoulas, people have trouble saying it, especially from looking at the word. My advice is don't look at the word, just think of the phrase chop a tulip, like very forcefully cut a tulip, and just change the P at the end to an S. Tchoupitoulas. Or you can just call it chop, which is what an awful lot of people here do. There's an old story, one of my favorite little New Orleans legends, that there was a morning long ago when all stories like this happened, and a cop was doing rounds in this neighborhood, and this cop at the corner of Tchoupitoulas and Common Streets, way behind me, right next to the Canal Street, found a dead horse in the street, and it was this guy's job to document the problem. Just document it, not his problem to solve. And so he got out his little report book to write up an incident report, and he wrote, "Dead horse found at the corner of Tried again. Dead horse found at the corner of Put his book away, reached down, grabbed a leg, dragged the horse for a block, got out his book again, and wrote, "Dead horse found at the corner of Magazine and Comet," because that was the easy thing to do. But don't. Across the street, we got the Dixie Mills Supply Company. Still going. There were a lot of milling companies in town, meaning people who provided fixtures, iron and steel fixtures for all kinds of different businesses. One such, it's right up here, and it's another one of the standout, unusual buildings in the neighborhood in terms of the matchup of style and function. This is a Gothic Revival office building. Office building is what it is today anyway. This is the home of the Preservation Research Center. If you ever wonder how New Orleans has so many historic buildings that are in, let's say, decent shape, set a reasonable bar, the PRC is a big part of the reason why. We also have across the way Cochon, This is an excellent Cajun Southern restaurant right there in the middle, tallish tan one. And right around the corner they have their deli called Cochon Butcher. Solid food option if you're visiting the World War II Museum, although a decent number of others too. So this was a millworks. It's not anymore. And it actually was serving that purpose back during the time of the 1874 Battle of Liberty Place that we mentioned earlier. So the Battle of Liberty Place was largely a fight between Confederate and United States veterans of the Civil War. And in the case of the White League, the people who ended up committing major share of the violence there, those were largely Confederate veterans, and among their supporters was the guy who ran that millworks back there. So one of the things he took upon himself to do was to provide weaponry to the White League. Guns, a cannon at one point, and it was investigation of just such a shipment of weapons that was being sent to them that in part led to those deadly events in 1874. Aspirational, let's call that. So if they underestimate alyssum, you can touch alyssum and it will do just fine. Vibe-wise, I kind of like this side of the neighborhood. The part closer to the river and the part further from the French Quarter tend to be a little more stark, I'll call it. Stuff that either has remained disused or has never been super cleaned up. By and large, we haven't passed by these things, but the newer developments in the neighborhood tend to be big condo towers with built-in gyms and restaurants and shopping and stuff. Food halls, we saw one of those. And sometimes converted warehouse buildings serving a pretty similar housing purpose. So that kind of stuff is kind of all over, and because of that, you do get kind of a modern sleekness in among a lot of the more antique fixtures. Whereas here and there, and mostly here, you can see what the neighborhood was like at its low point and how much it has changed in pretty recent times. Also got here, super innocuous, little urgent care, but this is probably the oldest building in the neighborhood. A little 1820-ish Creole cottage type of building that would have been common here at one time, but are mostly all gone at this point. I don't mean to say by mentioning the less spruced up things over here that this is not an area that has a lot going on. This is definitely a part of the neighborhood worth coming to, and at least parts of it are maybe the main thing that people visit the neighborhood for, coming up on various museums and art spaces. There's some of that good old dinge. So, crew of Red Beans, people behind Hire a Mardi Gras Artist. This was the organization that did some group fundraising to get Mardi Gras professionals hired to make stuff to put on houses, and they did an auction. So, this is just recently done. I think they actually extended it. I walked by the other day not knowing that this was happening here and saw this garage door open and a couple of people sitting at a table and just Mardi Gras paraphernalia behind them galore. They looked bored out of their minds, but I think sitting and selling anything, no matter how cool it is, gonna leave you feeling that way. Cobblestone Street, lining up with the vibe of the place as a whole. God made me funky here. Micro perfumery moving into the neighborhood. Who knows how much longer this will still be dingy. Coming up on the side of the Contemporary Arts Center. There we go. Those old painted ads. Across a window. Some open windows. Probably no central air in that building. This is the Contemporary Arts Center. Lots of different styles of performance and visual art here, and voila, something that does have a fresh coat of paint on it. That across the street is the Ogden Museum of Southern Art. This is where you would enter the Contemporary Arts Center. So while these guys have lots of different things going on depending on time of year, again, pretty contemporary, this side, the Ogden specializes in artists from the region, and that can mean a lot of different things. But what it often means is a solid dose, at least, of self-taught / outsider / folk art. People here call it a lot of different things, but they have a solid portion of that in their collection, so that's where you'd go in. If you walk by a lamppost out here, you often see them covered in little stickers with an O on them, which is what people do with their admission stickers afterwards. This is the Civil War Museum. This one, the oldest museum in Louisiana, goes way back. And I'd say the approach here is pretty anodyne. They mostly show like uniforms and it's just kind of artifacts. Here's what this was. There's not a lot of the higher level storytelling necessarily, which with the Civil War in particular, anytime you get very deep, it bothers somebody. So I don't know if that's a reason why it takes the approach it does, but it could well be. And the building, so the part over towards the right where you enter, is newer, but this side is the original part. And this is in a style we call Richardsonian Romanesque. You can get the vibe that it is borrowing from European castles, and it's basically like a revival of pre-Gothic European ways of building. So when you see these buildings on usually university campuses, a lot of times they're civic buildings too, big rough-hewn stone that they're made out of, that is probably derived from Henry Hobson Richardson, a guy who was a pretty big deal architect in the 19th century, from New Orleans, though he didn't actually work here. In keeping with the Civil War theme, we also have over here the pedestal where Robert E. Lee once stood. So the statue of Robert E. Lee here was pretty par for the course for Confederate monuments. A lot of the organizing around them came to be around the time of the death of the figure in question, so often Reconstruction and later, not immediately after the Civil War. That began to be organized right after Robert E. Lee's death and took about a decade and a half to put together. So it's an 1880s landmark. Came down just a few years ago. Full story to that. But another war we're focusing ourselves on is that of the National World War II Museum over here. So this eats up a couple of blocks right here. And it began with just this portion over here. Before it was ever called the National World War II Museum, this was the D-Day Museum. And if y'all saw our walk of St. Charles Avenue, then you'll know the reasons why this was an appropriate place to put such a thing, because we were the city where the Higgins boats that were used in the Normandy invasion on D-Day were built and designed. And so putting that on display here made a lot of sense. There also was a professor from UNO, the University of New Orleans, who was real dedicated to the subject and to getting the museum started, and it nearly got put out by the UNO campus, which is a good ways away from this part of town. But in the end, for convenience to our visitors, it ended up being situated right here, close to where everybody stays. So it's been expanded a lot. Monuments galore out here. You still have that original exhibit, which opened back in 2000, but then others that were added gradually. I think in their building plan of the last few years, this is the last thing that they've described is going to go up anytime real soon. So compared with that approach, the kind of here's an artifact, here's what it was, at the Civil War Museum, over here, it's a much more kind of active storytelling museum where, for one thing, I think it's worth knowing for anybody coming here from Europe or who's super familiar with the war already, that this is definitely a museum of the United States' role in World War II. And in that respect, there is room to expand for sure. And it's a pretty rah-rah approach to that subject. But in that way, it is in keeping with the understanding of the war from the time. And it also is a pretty immersive museum. You can sort of choose a character and follow them around. They've provided a lot of other sort of experiences. They have a little malt shop atmosphere over here. They have their theater over here, the Solomon Victory Theater, which you can go see the Victory Bells, the sort of jazzy trio performance, various other shows they do about pop culture from the era and moments of related history. All of this is their turf. So it's a really easy place to keep busy. And it's still likely, I don't know what their plans are for physical expansion, but they are still to this day bringing in World War II veterans to do oral histories. And in that way, it's, I think a lot of the excitement about this subject, both in terms of visitors and in terms of, funding. I don't know if as many people would come if this was like a National World War I museum. It just has less connection with living people and their descendants and our kind of understanding of, in the US, of how we got where we are. So, huge destination. Coming here puts you near all the other things that we have seen. And I mentioned one restaurant that you could hit up. But a little bit down the way here is the World War II Museum's own restaurant. And it was from them that I borrowed a certain little idea that we have riffed on today. See, is called the American Sector. They didn't make up the name, but them borrowing into the present was a piece of their many-pronged, excellent marketing. Wars have been a really big force in Americanizing this place. From like the War of 1812, which was the first time that Creoles and Americans really collaborated, to the Civil War, which of course, put New Orleans in the context of the South at large, to World War I, to World War II. All of these wars brought in a lot of people moving to the city. War is big business, of course, and so there's the need for people to work in various capacities. And so you do get these waves of often rural people from nearby who don't necessarily share the city's distinctive identity. So every one of those wars has made us a little bit more generally American. But I think the World War II played a reverse role at the same time. So World War II brought a lot of actual members of the military here, which those other wars did in their own way, but on less of a scale. Anyway, World War II brings a lot of people from other parts of the country to New Orleans for the first time. They're young men. They hang out on Bourbon Street, a very different Bourbon Street. They hear jazz for the first time. They form this nostalgia about a place that feels away from it all and peaceful, and especially in retrospect, after what you went through with the war, it might have become kind of a sense of a way of going back in time. And I feel like that's how still quite a lot of people think about New Orleans, indirectly. It certainly has a lot to do with our brand today, but it also was why those particular people, those World War II veterans, came here for ages afterwards, and they made this their vacation destination of choice. And that certainly brought us in this touristic direction that we've gone in ever since. So World War II, massive impact on New Orleans, and forever froze us as what people might positively think of as an exception to the rules of the rest of America. So we're on Magazine Street right now, and if you were to continue this walk, coming from the World War II Museum or on the way to it, Magazine continues right over there. And we did a video of a walk down Magazine Street, and you can see how the American development of the city kind of continues in that direction over time, of mid-19th to gradually early 20th century development as you go further and further. And that's very much a shopping and dining corridor these days on the other side of this bridge. So there's that. St. Charles Avenue tells a really similar story through more of a residential lens. If you'd like to see the homes of the people who owned these businesses down here, then oftentimes those are on St. Charles Avenue. So you can check out our walks along that street. And the Garden District is also a big piece of that story. So French Quarter, of course, is near all of this. So pairing those things together is a perfectly natural way to explore. So lots of ideas for what to do next. I hope something of that is inspiring to you, and I appreciate you staying through all the way to this point. And if y'all have any thoughts, please share them down below, and like and subscribe so we can be back in touch next time we create something new. And if y'all would like to tip your guide, that's how the company works. We are a pay what you will company. Tours are free to take in the cities where we operate live, apart from maybe a little reservation fee to keep things afloat. And then everything else is pay what you will. So if y'all like that notion, it is even something you can participate in online, and you'll find the information of how to do that down below. And enormous thanks to those of you who have done so. Y'all are lifesavers. So for today, signing off. See you again soon.